Today we are going to the mid-19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Adolph Louis Luetgert was born on the 27th of December 1845 in the German city of Gütersloh. He was a twin and one of 16 children. He had 13 brothers and 2 sisters. Luetgert had a reasonable education and studied hard, but like many children from Northern Europe in the 19th century, he finished his education when he was just 14 years old and went to work. He was given the position of an apprentice in a tannery. This was not new to him, as growing up he had often helped his father, who worked with animal hides, albeit on a smaller scale. Young Luetgert moved out of the family home and lived in accommodation provided by the factory owner. He was hard-working, resourceful, and a quick learner, and his employer, a well-respected businessman named Ferdinand Knabel, thought that his new apprentice would have a good future in his business. Luetgert, however, had other plans. He finished his apprenticeship, and when he turned 17, he left his employment and started to travel around the country, working for a couple of months and then moving on again. But nothing seemed to inspire the adventurous young man, so in 1864, Luetgert travelled to London. He had read about the Great London Exposition of 1862 and had long been fascinated to see life in Victorian Britain. However, he found it difficult to gain skilled employment and had to take low-paid manual work in order for him to pay for food and rent. He lived in poor, overcrowded conditions and soon realised that the fascinating tales he had read about Victorian London did not reflect the hard life in the city that he was living. He was still an ambitious young man, so saved some money and purchased a ticket for a ship bound for America. He arrived in New York in 1865 and then travelled to Quincy in Illinois, as he knew some people from his hometown who had settled there. But he was unable to find skilled work, so soon after he went on to Chicago, where he found work as a tanner at the Union Hide and Leather Company. He was now in skilled employment, earning a steady income, but he questioned what he had actually achieved. He was now 20 years old. He had left his tanning job in his hometown to travel around Germany, gone to London and crossed the Atlantic to end up working as a tanner, only in a different factory, a different city, and a different country. The tannery business was a busy and competitive industry, and Luetgert changed his employer a few times before eventually working for the Engley, Crosley & Co. tannery. On the 13th of April 1872, he married a young German lady named Carolina Repke, and soon after, he left his employment in the tannery. Encouraged by his wife, he set up a liquor store, and it soon became apparent that Luetgert had a good eye for business. It did not take long for the liquor store to become profitable, and soon his income was far greater to when he had worked in the tannery. In 1875, his wife gave birth to a son. The next year, a daughter was born. But tragically, one of the children died, and this was followed by the death of Carolina in November 1877, leaving Luetgert a widower with one very young child. He was not a widower for long, and on January the 18th, 1878, just 2 months after his wife's death, Luetgert married again, this time to the very pretty and petite Louise Bigness. She was also an immigrant from Germany and known locally as a very beautiful young woman who was 10 years his junior. On their wedding day, he gave Louise a gold ring that was engraved with her new initials, LL. The liquor business continued to be profitable, and Luetgert and Louise worked hard and tried to save money. They lived in a small apartment, as rather than pay more on rent, they were content to see their income increase without increasing their expenditure. For Luetgert, however, this wasn't enough. He had seen how the class system operated in Victorian London, and he wanted to be part of Chicago's elite business community. He possessed great entrepreneurial talent and worked as many hours as he could. Eventually he saw an opportunity in the sausage industry, so he gave up his liquor store and took his family to an apartment adjacent to the meat market. His sausage business started to flourish, and from making sausages from a small room behind the market, he moved the business to a larger premises. Although financially the couple were doing very well, their life had not been easy. Louise had given birth to 4 children, but only 2 survived past their first birthday. They now had a good business, a nice house, and everything that they could have dreamt of when they left Germany to travel across the Atlantic to the USA. Louise was content, but her husband still had great ambitions to make his sausage company the biggest in the country. He wanted to invest more and more into the business, while Louise was more cautious and thought that some money in the business and some other investments would be a better option. This caused many disagreements between them. In 1893, the World's Fair was held in Chicago. This was a great opportunity for Luetgert to promote his business, and during the fair, his sales and future orders soared. His business empire was growing, and he was becoming a very wealthy man. He did, however, continue to argue with his wife. She was still unhappy that he had invested so much of their money in the business, and would often tell him that he needed to invest in other things. Luetgert, however, was a persuasive man, and moved the business again to a towering 5-story factory. Next door he built a large 3-story family home for Louise and the children. He could now produce more sausages, and he dominated the market in Illinois and the surrounding states. But he wanted to sell his sausages all over America. He wanted his company to be the biggest sausage producer in the USA. In the new factory, Luetgert had a private office with a bed, and as he worked so many hours, he would sometimes sleep there. The family housekeeper, named Mary Simmering, always made the bed at the office, and rumours soon started to circulate. She was more than just a housekeeper. Workers would mention that the two seemed very familiar. Luetgert had also been seen in Chicago with a wealthy widow named Christine Fields. During the 1890s, the US economy went into a very large recession. Stock market prices went down and over 500 banks closed. This resulted in the failure of thousands of businesses and led to a massive rise in unemployment, which reached 25% in Pennsylvania, 35% in New York, and 43% in Michigan. The sausage factory, which had been doing so well, suddenly started to slow down, and soon sales plummeted. The factory's expenses were now greater than its sales. On top of this, some of the company's creditors started to call in their loans. Finding money was extremely difficult. The banks were not lending, and Luetgert hadn't taken his wife's advice to invest some money in other things, and she wasted no time in reminding her husband that she had told him on many occasions that expanding the business, putting them into debt, and not having a diverse investment plan was not a good strategy. Luetgert and Louise started to argue on a far more frequent basis, and their loud and heated disagreements were often heard by neighbours and passers-by. Soon the state of their marriage became the talk of the neighbourhood. Luetgert spent more and more time at his room in the factory and only ever seemed to go back to the house for food. In February 1897, the factory was closed, while Luetgert tried to raise more capital for the business. His wife Louise, however, was fed up with the way he treated her and told close friends and relatives that she wanted to leave him and thought it best if she just left the house and the factory and started a new life somewhere else. In early 1897, Luetgert purchased 2 barrels of caustic potash. This was something never seen in the factory before by the workers, and being a corrosive product, it didn't really have any place in the sausage factory. A few months later, on May the 1st, 1897, Luetgert took his wife to the factory. It was a mild evening, and he asked the night watchman to bring down the 2 barrels of potash. He asked him to take them to the boiler room. When in the boiler room, Luetgert poured the contents of both barrels into one of the steam vats that was usually used to dip sausages. He then told the night watchman to keep the steam going all night, and then sent him on an errand. When the night watchman returned, the boiler room door was bolted, so he returned to his post. At the same time, the lady who lived opposite, named Mrs. Agatha Tosh, saw some smoke coming from the factory chimney. She thought that it was slightly odd, as she knew that the factory was currently closed. 3 days later, on May the 4th, Louise's brother, named Diedrich Bignes, came to the house to visit his sister, and was very surprised to find that not only was she not at home, that she had not been home for 3 days. He asked his brother-in-law Luetgert if he knew where she was, and he said he did not. So Diedrich asked for children and the housemaid, but no one had any idea where Louise could be. He asked Luetgert if he had contacted the police regarding the disappearance of Louise, but Luetgert replied that he had not. Diedrich then went to the police himself to report his sister missing. He said that she'd have not just gone away and abandoned the children. It was very strange. Police Inspector Hermann Schuttler led the investigation to find Louise. The police questioned neighbours and relatives, and soon discovered that Louise and her husband were often arguing, and that Luetgert was under a lot of stress due to the downturn in his circumstances. It became apparent that the last time anyone had seen Louise was when she was seen on May the 1st, entering the factory with her husband. A witness came forward who told the inspector that on May the 1st he was walking past the factory when he heard a noise which he thought sounded like a lady screaming. The neighbour, Mrs. Agatha Tosh, told the police that on May the 2nd, Luetgert came to her house and asked her not to tell anyone that he was using the vat in the factory. She added that he told her that the factory was closed and he wasn't really allowed to be there. Following this information, Inspector Schuttler decided to search the factory, and on May the 15th, he arrived with a team of officers. The night watchman told the inspector about Luetgert's strange behaviour in the boiler room with the steam vat, and the inspector decided to look there. The vat was half filled with a brown liquid. With the help of the night watchman, the police drained the vat, and at the bottom they found some small pieces of bone, and as they looked more closely, they discovered 2 corset steels and a gold ring with the initials LL engraved on the inside. The police then searched the area outside where the ashes from the smokehouse were dumped, and their search uncovered part of a human skull and other pieces of bone. On interviewing the people who were looking after the factory during its period of closure, the police discovered that between May the 2nd and May the 17th, Luetgert had tried many times to enter the factory, but his attempts were always denied. On May the 18th, Luetgert was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. On August the 24th, 1897, Luetgert's trial begun. The press were fascinated with the story, and it was front-page news all over Illinois. Luetgert's defence team told the court that Louise had simply gone away. There was no body, so proving she was dead was going to be difficult for the prosecution. But there was the ring and the potash. His lawyers claimed that the potash was purchased to make soap to clean the factory. This was countered by the prosecution, as the amount purchased would have been enough to clean the factory for months, and it would have worked out a much more expensive way of getting soap than just buying it from his usual supplier. Deputy Sheriff Frank Moan also told the court that when he took possession of the factory, they conducted an audit of stock, which showed that there were more than 100 boxes of soap in the storeroom. The defence also said that the ring had been lost, and that the bones found were animal bones. The prosecution decided to conduct their own experiment, to find out if a body boiled in caustic potash would disappear. So they obtained a corpse and put it in an identical vat to the one in the factory, and they added the potash mixture. After a few hours, the body had disappeared. All that was left was a brown liquid. Bone experts also testified that the small pieces of bone found at the factory were indeed from a human. The court received a letter allegedly written by Louise Luetgert, in which she said she was living in Chicago with friends. Handwriting experts were given the letter, but they concluded that Louise had not written it, and it was a hoax, probably designed to put an element of doubt in the mind of the jury. Soon, however, other sightings emerged, and it seemed that Louise was being seen all over America. One stated that she had been seen boarding a ship in New York, bound for Europe. On the 18th of October, 1897, the jury was sent out to deliberate, and they deliberated for 3 days, returning on the 21st of October. The result was a hung jury. A second trial was ordered, which began a month later, and had the same press frenzy. This time, the jury unanimously found the defendant, Adolph Louis Luetgert, guilty of the murder of his wife, and on February the 9th, 1898, he was sentenced to life in prison. However, he did not serve much of his time, as on July the 7th, 1899, just 18 months after being sentenced, Luetgert died in his cell at the Hoylett Penitentiary. The cause of death was degenerative heart disease. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any feedback or comments you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case.